Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, which is, as a title, covering the Synod 60 Days that shaped a turning point in the Church. Over the course of this webinar, we will have the conversation between Dr. Michael Higgins, who wrote the book, A Synod Diary, 60 Days That Shook the Church, and Christina Skinner, who will be doing also the part of the conversation with Michael. And my name is Father Edward Shatov. I'm Augustinian of the Assumption, living in Quebec City and looking after the Center Culture and Faith and working in the partnership with Navalis Publishing Group for looking after the webinars. So we will discuss the book in the way, the theme of the book, and not doing the review of the book that Michael Higgins wrote on the Synod on synodality. And the book was just published by the Navalis Publishing Group. So thank you very much, Christina. Thank you very much, Michael, joining us for this webinar. And I would ask you just simply, why do you think the Synod on the synodality is important, was important, still important, and why you, Michael, wrote a book on this that you gave a title that is quite provocative because it makes a reference to another book in history and in literature. And after that, you tells us your reasons for writing this book. We will turn to Christina and ask you, Christina, what is the interest to read this book and think on this question? So, Michael, please, can you share with us your thoughts?
Certainly, Edward. Happy to do so. When Paulus Press, which is the American publisher for the book, Novellis, of course, is the Canadian, asked me to consider writing the book, it was not to provide a commentary on synodality. It's not the work of a church historian. It's not a theological investigation into the nature of synods, juridically speaking, and synods in theologically speaking. It was to acquire, to provide a portrait, if you like, of the personalities, of the ideas, of the rhythm, of the fire of the synod. And the perception that the publishers had and that I have is that this is a synod unlike any other. And it is a portal, a way of entering into a new understanding of what church means. As a consequence, I decided the best way to give it a personal taste was to turn it into a kind of an amuse-bouche, a prolegomenon, an opening to deeper discussion by capturing something of the flavor or the color of the synod. Now, I've covered synods before. The first synod I covered was in 1985. It was the Extraordinary Synod convoked by Pope John Paul II to examine what has happened in the Church 20 years after the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council in 1965. It was a very exciting moment, and I went to a couple of what are called ordinary synods afterwards, one on the priesthood, one on the laity, and have observed from a distance synods subsequent to those three. I have to tell you, the experience on the ground of the synod we just came out of, which was a two-session synod, October of 2023, October of 2024, and then the years prior, building up the material and the consultation, is unlike any in the experience of the Roman Universal Church. So when I use the title, The 60 Days That Shook the Church, it is, of course, provocative. And they're not the 60 days that brought down the Romanovs and ushered in the Bolsheviks and whatnot. It didn't happen that long. I remember talking to Jim Martin, the American Jesuit, who said to me, Michael, I think maybe you should have said the 60 years that shook the church. And I said, possibly, maybe even 6 centuries that shook the church. But the 60 days are, I think, emblematic of the tremendous rush of the Spirit in the lives and in the thinking of the individuals gathered as synod delegates in Rome for those 2 sessions. And as often is the case, great revolutions don't happen overnight. And one has to remember, not altogether a happy analogy, admittedly, but one has to remember that the French Revolution actually began with the storming of the Bastille. And that, in fact, was considered a largely innocuous event. And then, of course, it ushered in great change. So too with this. This is not a Bastille moment, really, but it is a moment that allows us to think of the church in a slightly different way as it evolves into a slightly different incarnation, continuous with the past, but also open to the future. That was Francis's intention, and he lived to attend both of the sessions. That's the background.
Yes, Michael, thank you very much. And Christina, then you approach the Synod of Synodality and Michael's reflections. What do you think? What is the interest for such a conversation?
So I'll tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from and why this interests me. So 5 years ago, I began a doctorate, and I knew I wanted to look at abuse of power in the church. And lo and behold, the synod was about to happen just at the same time as I was starting to kind of consider these questions. So I became involved with Concerned Lay Catholics, which is co-sponsoring this with Novalis, and through them became quite involved in the process of learning about the synod and engaging in the synodal conversations. And got to be in Rome when Michael was there, so we had lots of the conversations that stories appear in this synodal diary. So I was personally interested because I ended up realizing that synodality really can help us address the problems of clericalism, which are at the root of the abuses of power in the church. So, the more that I have learned about it, the more I realize how absolutely marvelous it is and how it's really our hope to fix some of the really substantial problems we have in the church, that are at the root of the sexual abuse crisis, that are causing us to have a crisis of credibility with people. So what I especially appreciated about Michael's book is that it is what he says. It's just a taste. It's just enough to give people a sense of what synodality is all about so they can do a deeper dive later. But also it's full of stories, which is really engaging. Like it's nice to know who the characters are, what some of the disputes are, who the players are. Because nothing we do on a theoretical level is untouched by the players, by the personalities, by the perspectives, by where people come in their social location around the world. So that's one of the reasons I was especially kind of interested in dealing with this book. Yeah.
Yeah, and I should say, and I don't know if you would agree with me. First of all, when we read your book, Michael, and I'm sure we will have this during our conversation generally about the theme of synod and synodality. I have even more like pleasure and interest that of reading the conclave, that everyone was talking about before the uh, election of the new pope, because uh, uh, it was a fictional book, the novel, the conclave, and your book is quite grounded in reality, talking about what happens. And the other thing is that your book is helping to understand and the procedures and the documents, how they were produced, why they were produced, and how it's supposed more or less worked. So then we can discuss or approach the synod in our local realities. But before going into this, can you tell us what is exactly this synod? What is this? Let's say, peace to which the Pope Francis invited everyone, and that the Pope Leo now is going to deal with in terms of continuing, developing, fostering? What is the synod, and how does it work?
Good question. The Synod is an ecclesial gathering. It has a long history in the Church, although in recent centuries was more localized than universalized. The reactivation of the Roman Synod came under Pope Paul VI, and then we began to have synods with some degree of regularity. We would have ordinary synods every 3 to 4 years. We would have periodic extraordinary synods, and we would have special synods that were called uniquely to address a particular crisis facing the Church Universal. The synods were episcopal. Okay, they were gatherings of bishops who were sent as delegates from their regional conferences, and they gathered in Rome, and they gave very short orations or interventions. And then they went into what are called the circoli minores, which are the small discussion groups, which were language specific. They then crafted propositions, the proposiciones, and then they sent them to the Pope, and the Pope wrote a final report that would appear sometime shortly after the synod ended, more often several months, if not a year, after the synod's conclusion. That was the pattern. That was the template. Francis changed that. He changed it radically. First of all, he invited lay people to be a substantial presence at the synod itself. And of that lay composition, the majority actually were women. He also made sure that even though synods are technically episcopal, they draw on the expertise and competencies of several, and so he allowed everyone a similar vote. Now, this was quite disturbing for some operating out of a narrow canonical or theological understanding of the church, but they accepted it, and they certainly accepted it in the synod hall. And then they prepared this report after a fair degree of preparation and examination and amendments and consultation and whatnot, and it's called the final report. The final report, which is about 40 pages, single-spaced, actually caught the mood, the positions, and the fever, if you like, fever and fervor, because it was so passionate and so devoted to the synodal process, that the Pope did something again, which was precedent-setting. He accepted it as the ordinary magisterium of the Church. He did not edit, he didn't redact, he didn't sift through curial consultants. He accepted it as it was, because he had been there for the majority of the synod sessions. So the synod process was a very different process. It was a process in which people sat around tables, usually about 12, 10 delegates, a secretary and a relator, and then there would be discussions, and the discussions would be based on a accepted pattern of prayer and silence, punctuated by observation. All would be time specific. And they were designed in the end to achieve one specific goal above all others, and that was to create an atmosphere of respect. So what he did is to shatter the model of adversariality that we see in such evidence around culture wars and everything else, and move to a deeper understanding of baptized Christians coming together. First of all, entering into a process, conversations in the Spirit, in which they came into a deep respect for their interlocutor's opinion. And I think that this was a stroke of genius, because what Francis did, and I have to say, to be quite honest, and I say this in the book, at first I found this objectionable, because journalists and writers have to have access to people and to ideas, and clearly we weren't getting that access. He imposed a custody of the tongue, if you like, on the participants by saying, look, don't be platforming, don't be giving your private press conference, don't be giving insights. You'll shatter the trust and confidence of the exercise itself. This was extremely frustrating for those of us covering the Synod, though it protected those who were participating in the Synod by allowing them to truly speak with parrhesia, to speak freely without fear of commentary or disclosure. Eventually, I came to understand why he did this and accepted the restrictions that were put in place. Because the synodal exercise was also an exercise in spirituality, in meditation, in Jesuit insight or Ignatian insight. And so he wanted it to be more a retreat than just a gathering of diverse opinion, because he wanted to set a cultural setting that would allow people to engage in such a way that they can actually discover something about the truth of what somebody else was saying. I'll end this with this one comment that Cardinal Schönborn, now the Archbishop Emeritus of Vienna, observed at one point. I think it was in the first session, where he said he was speaking to somebody, I think Cambridge or possibly Oxford, who was also connected to the UN. And he said to the Cardinal, if we operated in the way you are operating here in the Synod Hall, in the Hall of the United Nations in New York, we would have a very, very different world. And I think that's one of the intentions of Francis, because he didn't want it to be an ad intra exercise. It had to have an ad extra, identifying and speaking to the world. And Pope Leo, has demonstrated in his own way that he's accepted this model by creating a situation where the cardinals will now gather in consistorial fashion once a year with him to act, to think, and to pray synodally. Now, that's just cardinals. It's not the rest of the church, but it is a model. It's built on the template, I think, that Francis established with the Synod in Rome.
It's very interesting, Michael, because you was administrator, teacher, professor in many institutions, and as a journalist, you also observe the Synod. And now, Christina, tell us maybe, before you share about your vision of Synod, tell us a little bit more, because not everyone knows you. And what is your situation in terms of position in life from which you were living and observing the Synod?
Okay, so I am a mom with a bunch of kids
Yeah.
who I learned the importance of listening as a parent in a family. I've also worked in as a lay pastoral minister for most of my adult life, and also straddled academia. So I was in a PhD program many, many years ago,
Yeah.
and always never really left the world of thinking about things at a
Yeah.
really deep level. And now I find myself back in the world of academia again. So I have a great deal of experience working in the church. Now, I didn't know what synodality was. In fact, the first time I heard it, it was a German priest said something about the German synodal path, and I thought it was something like the Camino de Santiago in Spain.
Yeah.
Like, and that was only 2 years before I started studying it. So, like,
Yeah.
I knew nothing about synodality in the sense that we're talking about it now, officially, but as a lay minister, I practiced it. So when there were conflicts in the church between people who were very traditional and people who were not and wanted the church to move in a different direction, and the priest who was, in charge ultimately. I listened all the time to everyone, to try to find out what was the heart of their desires. So if you can find out what's motivating people, why do they want this kind of liturgy, why do they want this music, why do they dislike that, why do they like that, then you can often understand sometimes the deepest part is the same. And so you can then find a way to help people work together. I did it in my first communion programs. Like when a family came and they didn't feel like they could understand, or they could commit to what we were asking them to commit to. I didn't say, well, these are the rules. I said, well, tell me about your life. Tell me about how we could make this process work. And so when it was natural for me, when I discovered synodality, uh, to know that it works, for I believe that at the root of a lot of the polarization is that people don't feel listened to. At the very heart, people feel like nobody's listening to me. So they vote in radical ways because they want to make a lot of noise. Because that's what you do if nobody's listening. That's what my 3-year-old granddaughter does. If nobody's listening to her, she starts to yell. And so, and I think our church is quite polarized, our world is quite polarized. And so, as I study uh, the need for the church to change, as I think about my whole history of working in the church and really trying to serve families in a way that would serve them and not just make them jump through hoops, it just makes so much sense from a human perspective. It also makes sense if you really believe that every one of us is created in the image and likeness of God, then we need to listen to every one of us. And it also just makes good organizational sense. If you listen to a lot of people, you're going to be smarter. You're going to make better decisions. So I think it's just because of my location, because of my experiences, I just think it is so important that we move in this direction.
So let us go into the matter of the synod and the challenges that the synod faced. But before we do this, I will just say one word, because we have participant and they I'm sure they want to ask you some questions. So for all participants of this webinar, you can use the Q&A box to write your questions, and in a few minutes, Michael and Christina will reflect on your questions, and I will moderate this in a certain way. So please do not hesitate, write your questions and we will answer. But now we go into the matter of the synod. What are all the biggest challenges that you think this synod on synodality faced? And what was the suggestions to answer these challenges? Because there is no such a thing like the answer that you, Michael, pointed even in your book, but there was attempts to give certain answers to certain challenges. So what for you, Michael, let's say the three, let's say maybe less, maybe more biggest challenges, and how the synod dealt with that? And Christina, what would be for you, and observing this synod, and after reading the Michael's book, what are these challenges? So
Okay, it's going to be difficult to get three, but I will get three. Limit myself to three. The general theme of the synod dealt with communion and mission and whatever. But what was important again was as much the manner as the matter, Edward. And I think this is something
yeah,
Christine was also speaking to. You gathered the people in Rome. They had a structure which they were to address. But what was important to understand is that very little was excluded. There were topics that they decided should be dealt with at greater depth, and established 10 study groups. And these study groups exist still. They've given preliminary reports. They'll be given their final report, hopefully, by the end of Easter or whatever. To deal with the contentious issues. To give you one example, the ordination of women in ministry at the diaconal level, the priestly level was never even came up, but the diaconal level certainly, because of the existence of 2 prior commission reports. That's just one of many. There were others as well. And some of them were very specifically cultural and regional. For instance, the African bishops raised on several occasions the challenges of polygamy. This is an important, immediate pastoral challenge on their plate, right? And that is, and in North America, there's greater openness too, but also great argument around LGBTQT issues. So some of them were specific to particular regions. What was important to understand, again, is the process. This is the radicality of the Synod. It's not in the content particularly. There were no changes in doctrine. There were no basic changes in discipline, as far as I can see. What there was a creation of an attitude and openness, a realization that we can be ecclesia in a different way. We can be what Christine alluded to, is a church that actually listens, not just a church that receives, but a church that listens. That's why I think that the Synod has empowered the laity in a way that would satisfy Saint Dr. John Henry Newman, because, of course, it's the realization, if you like, in institutional, incarnational terms, of his argument of the importance of the laity in the life of the church. The more the laity become involved in the life of the church, not at a superficial level, not running bingo games and lotteries and handling some of the finances, but actually participating with the pastor in serious reflection, at a regular, not just spasmodic calendar, the greater the ownership, if you like to use that word, that people have in the life of the church is deepened, strengthened, and enhanced. So now you can appreciate that this could be terrifying for some prelates and for some Catholics who say, well, we're Protestantizing the church. We're no different than a human resources committee sitting down talking about strategic planning. This has nothing to do with the life of the church. Francis made it clear that such a view, indeed, is not just arcane, it's utterly wrong. He draws on the tradition in Latin America of conversations in the spirit, partially Ignatian, but not exclusively so. The experience he had at Aparecida, when he went to that great Salem conference in Brazil and was a major figure or architect in the writing of their final report. The realization that you need people to be in the room, to be at the table, not at the end of the hall, but at the table. So when you went to Rome in the past, covering the Synod, as I did on several occasions, you went to the press conference of the Holy See, La Stampa della Santa Sede, and then you also, on occasion, were admitted as an auditor, somebody who just listens, in the back of the Synod Hall. Now, the Synod Hall was not the Paul VI Hall. It was a small chamber in which the delegates gathered in row forms. They were layered, sequenced row forms. So you can imagine where the laity were. We were at the absolute back, right? Francis changes the geography as well as the choreography of the entire synodal process. So everybody, the delegates, are sitting at the table. There's no hierarchy. They're sitting in a circle. And this frees them up to see the others at the table as their friends in the faith, rather than as somebody they're going to be in contest with or arguing with. It wasn't a press conference. The press conference is what the journalists were limited to. The Synod delegates actually sat around the table. So, what did the Synod offer? It offers the future. This is not a scary thing. It's an enlivening experience of the life of the church. It's the continuation of the Second Vatican Council. That's why Pope Leo has emphasized again and again its continuity with the Council. Very important, I think, is that it offers hope. More than once, several times, mostly European, but not exclusively, would the Synod delegates say at the press conferences, where they were, by the way, wonderfully open and transparent, again, in sharp contrast with the past. They said that if we don't become a synodal church, we'll be no church at all. And this was really sometimes very starkly articulated, that this isn't a polite option. This cuts to the very heart of ecclesial self-understanding. So the Synod was a breakthrough moment in the history of the church. It will take decades to incorporate its wisdom. It will happen in different ways at different paces, depending on the society in which the church is embedded. But it's a process that Francis began, that Leo is pledged to continue, and that all the synod delegates who were there for those two sessions are committed to realizing. The issue now, and I'll end on this point, the issue now, as we were coming out of the Mass concluding the first session of the Synod, I said to Thomas Rees, an American Jesuit who covers the Vatican regularly, I said, now this is a very interesting thing, Tom, because 365 people, 364 plus the Pope. So we got 365 people at the Synod. They have a wonderful experience. Even very rare, maybe just a couple are annoyed by the whole thing. But the vast majority buy in. They didn't when they landed. They did at the end of the first session. And you could hear them talk about their conversion of attitude in the press conferences and the wonder that they changed their mind. They said, oh, wait, I thought this was going to be free for all. It was anything, but it was a synod in the real sense of the term, as opposed to the synods of the past, which were scripted, tightly controlled, and excluding everybody but the bishops themselves. So the Reese said to me, what do you say, Michael? I'm saying, well, how do we bring that spirit, that energy, and we transmit it to the 1.4 billion Catholics who weren't in the Synod Hall? And he said to me, look, in my professional life, I'm a political scientist, and I know one thing, and that is this: leadership. If the leadership is not there for this, then it will atrophy. And that will be a crisis for the church if that were to be true. So it's in the hands of the national episcopal conferences now to run with this. It's in the hands of every baptized Catholic to participate and make happen. But the initiative, the energy, and the focus must come from the national conferences of bishops.
Michael, it's very interesting that you're saying, but one of the big specialists of the Second Vatican Council, Father Giles Routier, the former dean of the theology faculty at the University of Laval and one of the counselors to the Pope Francis for preparing the Synod on Synodality.
Yeah.
He also said the hierarchy and the leadership is important, but what is also important is local structures, parishes, and communities. Yes. So, Christina, how you see this kind of thing of the challenges of Synod in the, let's say, our more daily grounded incarnate life?
So there's a couple of things. The first thing is we as human beings resist change. At the most granular, small level, don't move the mailbox. That will bug people. So big change like this is just really hard. It's kind of counterintuitive for us. There must be something in us that keeps us kind of located in one spot. So it's a hard process. And in the final document, there's a lot of talk of conversion, and conversion is conversion, personal conversion, but conversion of structures, conversion of relationships. There's a whole list of conversions we need. And it's hard. So it's just going to be a lot of work. And some people will opt out because it's easy, it's too hard. We don't, but so's the Christian life. And so people opt out of that too. So I don't think I just think that's an obstacle. We have to recognize how hard it is and how people cling to their power. It's very hard for people when they fear their power is going to be surrendered to surrender it, right? Mm-hmm. The ironic thing is, my experience of pastoral ministry is the more you listen to people and the more you include their needs, the less you actually have to worry about power. Because people listen to you because you're listening to them.
That's right. There's reciprocity. Yeah. There's reciprocity.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is, for lay people, we feel quite powerless. Like, what happens when Father comes in and he thinks this is a crock, or it's just not even worth listening to? Maybe he hasn't even considered it. What do? How do you promote synodality when in your local situation, and your local situation may be not just your local parish, but every parish within driving distance doesn't buy into synodality. Well, maybe you belong to the Catholic Women's League, so you can be synodal there. Maybe you help in the local soup kitchen. You can be synodal there. You can decide we're not going to just decide for these people how we're going to feed them. We're going to include them on our team. You know, there's so you the more I learn about synodality, the more I realize you don't, while it is very difficult if your leadership is not buying in, you don't have to stop and wait for the leadership.
I see. I think you do, actually, Christine. And
Mm,
I disagree with you and Gilles on this because it seems to me that the thrust of synodality shouldn't be determined by or controlled by the bishops. I think that's right. I think the lay people and the rest of the church have to embrace it and they will drive it. But it's the kickstart has to come from the bishops
yeah.
because look, frankly,
Mhm.
a great number of people, parish leaders and pastors, they don't talk about synodality in their homilies because they don't know what it is.
Mhm.
I mean, the problem is a problem of education, a problem of catechesis. We need to be able to educate priests about what synodality is so it doesn't frighten them. And
Yes.
they, in turn, communicate to their parish congregants what it is and why they're going to act on this in a way that is not threatening. But if the priests don't read about synodality, know very little about it, I can assure you from my experience that very few of them have read the final report. Very few of them have followed the synod in any way, and unless they read the Catholic press, they have no knowledge of what the synod is about. Right. So
Mhm.
we need to educate them. And I came up with an idea with another journalist who's brother is a cardinal, who was commenting on the fact that how can we do this in a practical way? Maybe you need to write a book about the history of synods. No, no, that's the last thing I need to do.
Mhm.
First of all, I'm not a church historian, and secondly, no one will read it. So I said, no, no. What we need is like a pamphlet, a small pamphlet, maybe 5 pages, like the old Catholic Truth Society used to distribute in Great Britain, in which you have a topic. What is synodality? What does the term mean? How do you make it happen in your parish? 5 page pamphlet. People can read it.
Yeah.
Insert it in the parish bulletin. Put it at the back of the parish. Distribute it in Catholic schools amongst Catholic educators and spiritual animators. A small booklet. It's not threatening. It will explain what synodality is, and it seems to me we're at that very fundamental, elementary level. And so, as a consequence, pastors say, well, I don't know what synodality is about, so they don't do anything. So this tremendous wave of inertia takes over the entire structure. Have to tell you from my experience, people are not hostile to synodality, including pastors. They're
Mhm.
not
Mhm.
indifferent to synodality. They're just
Mhm.
uncomprehending. They don't know what it is.
Mhm. Mhm.
And once
Michael,
they
it's
know what
yeah.
it
Yeah.
is, they can move
Yeah.
more comfortably within its terrain.
Michael, I think it's very important what you are saying, and it's not contradictory or it's not a disagreement even with Christina,
Yeah.
but it's you are underlying a particular responsibilities or particular circle of the or part of the church, which is the clergy, the bishops, the pastors.
That's
They
right.
we should do what we're supposed to do, and also help people to become more than they are, to be challenged and challenge each other in a good like constructive way.
Yeah.
In your book, and you already like put a step forward about my next question before we turn to participants. In your book, you wrote, we shouldn't fear disagreement, even fiery disagreement. But what we should fear is an adversality that is rigidly ideological and fundamentalist. I think that's one of the keys and of the comprehension of the synod, but also the basis or basics to build the synodal way, and on the part of the clergy and of the part of the laity. But in your book and in your reflection, and I'm sure, Christina, you were very attentive to this. Michael, you tells us that during this synod, you went through ongoing conversion about one particular subject or one particular ecclesial reality, and you really put it as a conversion. So what is that? Can you tell us more? And then I would ask Christina to tell us, how did you receive this testimony of this conversion?
I would be happy to. First of all, just to say my disagreement with Gilles and Christine and with you is a disagreement in the spirit, not in, it's not argumentative. I don't dispute the fact that
Yeah.
synodality has to be embraced and motivated by and maintain its momentum with the leadership, with outside the leadership, regular Catholics. But the leadership, as I mentioned, has to kickstart it. That's why they're leaders. Okay, that was my point. But here's my conversion moment. I was in Rome, and I was on my way back to the mother house of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate on the Via Aurelia, and I was standing outside the Vatican Wall waiting for one of the endless and full buses in which it's impossible to move and breathe, but that's the reality of Roman life, especially during the Jubilee year when the population increased tenfold. And while I was getting there, on my way to it, a deacon from the Netherlands came over to me and said, Antwerp actually, came over to me and said, I want, Michael, I want you to introduce you to this wonderful woman. And I think, you know, this could be an engaging conversation. And she was very much attached to a movement, an advocacy movement in good faith for the ordination of women to the diaconate. That was very clear. So I went, and it's interesting, there was a barrier between the two of us. She was on one side and I was on the other. She started to explain in wonderfully practiced and well-accented English, where she stood. She was a mother, and very much like Christine, she started off by saying, you know, that I'm a mother. I know something about familial life, but this is not some abstraction for me. And she then made an argument for the inclusion of women in the rite or in the ministry of ordination, hence the diaconate. I mean, there's a great debate about whether it should be an ordained ministry or whatever, but irrespective of that, she was making that argument. As I was listening to her, I started off and I could feel myself getting the arguments coming to the fore why this would be unwise, because hitherto I had made the case, not particularly popular in many circles, that the ordination of women in ministry was premature because we needed a radical rethinking of the presbyterate and the diaconate in the church, and particularly how we identify candidates and most especially how we form them. Not a great fan of the seminary. It seems to me a wonderful product of the 17th century, and we should have left it there. But the problem is it kind of shortchanges the church in terms of enabling others to minister as a consequence. And I realize that, but perhaps I just put it at the back of my head. She forced me to re-engage with it. She spoke in a way that was passionate without being hysterical. And men can be just as hysterical as women, so it's not a gender-specific thing. She was not overly zealous, but she was deeply convinced. But most importantly, what she taught me was respect. She actually spoke. There was a pause. I spoke in response. Further pause. We didn't enter into prayer. It wasn't the synodal structure, but the experience changed me. I changed my mind as a consequence of actually listening to her, not forming or marshaling my arguments, but simply by listening to her. I realized that the argument she was making was a compelling one, and that if it is true that both of us shared the view, a view, by the way, shared by popes since 1962 with the opening of the council, that clericalism has held the presbyterate or the priesthood captive or hostage, and that we need to break out of that clericalist worldview. And we both shared that, but she saw a different way moving forward than I did. And I had foreclosed that way of moving forward because I was convinced of the rightness of my own position. She forced me to rethink. That's a form of conversion.
Yes, and you, Christina, how did you read? How did you react? What do you think? And which thoughts just go through your heart, through your mind when you listen to Michael?
Well, I just loved that Michael wrote that and that he also wrote about his other conversion, about how hard it is for him to sit and listen, because I actually really relate to that. So, I mean, it's one of the gifts of the book is that it's a very honest, so as a woman working in the church for my entire life, like honestly, since I was 15, I've been involved, right? I never ever stopped. Um, and knowing that I bring gifts. I don't know what gifts of mine are specific to me being a woman or what's just because I happen to have this specific genetic composition I do. But I know I bring gifts. And I know in my experience how often I had to write something and have Father read it, knowing it was my work.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I had to pretend not to be the one that was actually the voice or that was the one doing the work, right? It's very, it's, it's unjust, you know?
Mhm.
Um, so for me, it was really wonderful to see you write that, Michael, uh, and to just acknowledge that people can change. With respect to this idea that, the church is clericalist, and so therefore, admitting women to a clerical structure is not going to actually change things. There are people who've chosen to be ordained women outside the Catholic Church because they didn't want to be in a clericalist structure. So this argument doesn't only come from people like you, or it also has come from women. Um, Personally, I think that's not likely to make things change. Just saying, well, you can't come in until we're just. Because quite frankly, when is that going to be? You know, um, we've been a good but sinful lot since the beginning of time. So, I think we change by bringing as much goodness into the system as we can.
So let's
And
move
live
to the
that.
changes and move to the conversation with participant. And the first question from Mary Craig: do you see any changes for the better as a result of the synod? I do not any changes in my church, so am I missing something?
Yes, you are missing something, Mary, and that cuts to the heart of a good deal of the discussion we've just been having. That how do you instrumentalize or utilize the wisdom and the spirit of the synod itself so that it gets implemented at the local level? Because it really does have to be implemented at the local level. That's going to depend again on leadership. And it does seem to me that if you set up a structure or an architecture in which certain specific goals need to be achieved in order to respond to the Vatican's request for reports on its implementation of synodality. You've got to remember that Pope Francis made sure that this thing wouldn't peter out, pardon the pun, wouldn't peter out because he instituted a 3 year implementation phase, which Pope Leo confirmed. So the General Secretariat of the Synod, which is a unique, discrete body in the curial structure, has oversight for synodality across the world. They're going to be looking at these various and several jurisdictions. And when you talk to some people, like Sister Nathalie Becca, who is a sister involved in the whole practice of synodality, centered in Rome, she will tell you, and she's quite hopeful. Yes, there are large sections of the church that yet to buy into it, but in her experience, traveling in Latin America and Africa and Asia, she has found that there's tremendous enthusiasm for it, and that many of the local clergy have indeed bought into it and allowed it to free them up. Because I think Christine is quite right about this. That it when you once you realize it's not simply the devolution of power, it's the liberation that comes with the freedom of not having to do everything, that you've got all these partners working with you, these baptized partners with their own gifts or charisms. So, yes, we're at a very early stage. Um, I've talked to a couple of people who are on the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops committee to deal with this. They're not exactly hopeful because I think they're discovering what Christine had said earlier on, and that it seems to be the fundamental human pathology, if it is a pathology, that we resist any kind of change, that we just hunker down and we say, "Oh no, we don't." It's labor intensive, it's disruptive, but all the great events of the church and of the world are the result of disruptions. Somebody coming along and disrupting something and changing it for the better as a consequence. There was this guy in Nazareth called Jesus. He disrupted the entire plan. So it seems to me not unreasonable for us to recognize the fear we have of change, but to embrace it and to say, yes, change we must. And change doesn't mean casting off everything of the past. It means the careful discernment or discrimination between what is essential and what is peripheral, what is cultural and what is at the heart of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And
I would
yeah,
agree that don't give up hope. Sometimes it's helpful to keep the big picture in mind. So you may be in a situation in your parish where nothing is happening. In fact, there's even a resistance or a refusal to listen to this. But we're part of a long history. So we don't always get to see everything come to fruition in our life, right? Something is happening that is going to radically change the way the church works. And I think for good. And so I'm very hopeful, even though I'm actually not really seeing it all that much in my local situation.
but talking about your local situation, Carol Kuzmochka asks you, Christine. Christine, thank you so much for so clearly grounding your relationship with synodality in the concrete context of your life as well in your current doctoral studies. You mentioned how you see synodality as a hopeful response to clericalism. Can you say more about that?
Clericalism is locating all the power, all the holiness, all the decision making in one person or one set of people. And synodality is quite frankly the opposite. And synodality won't function with clericalist leaders, um, but it has the potential to dismantle it, I think, because if it's put in place, whether you want it to be or not, which one might say is kind of authoritarian, um, and you end up in conversation with people, it changes us. Conversations change us. And when you speak heart to heart, even if you start off with resistance and ideological kind of blinders, um, it's hard to not hear the pain of another. It's not impossible, but it's hard if you're
Yes.
open at all. So, and that's why I think Michael's story is so great because we do change when we have encounters. We don't change radically sometimes. Sometimes it's a long position, but I think that's why I think it's so important because I do think it can help us confront clericalism that way.
Thank you. And I will put two other questions together, maybe, and maybe it can help us to reflect to both of you. One is from the Dario Winkler. Why this circle sharing type method for the process for the synod? Where did it come from? Who suggested this new form of meeting? Was it in any way influenced by indigenous methods or discussing important matters of the community? Indigenous cultures learn and listen and discuss things through sharing circles, healing circles, teaching circles, and so on. And Joseph Sinazak asks you, do you think the synodal process made progress in eliminating opposing camps within the church? It looks to me like circles and camps. It's not exactly the same thing. How does it work?
Well, certainly, as Gerald knows, because he was there, as indeed was Christine, at the Waterloo Synod, which was the only synod held in Canada after the conclusion of the Episcopal Synod in Rome. The gathering at St. Jerome's University in Waterloo was not an Episcopal gathering. It's not an Episcopal synod. It didn't have the canonical power of an Episcopal synod. It was an ecclesial assembly in a way in which we gathered. And one of the most impressive modalities, if you like, of that gathering were the indigenous peoples. Every one of the tables, 10 tables, had representatives from the different indigenous communities, Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, whatever. They were there and they made enormous contributions to the table. And going around the table or in the circle was not a foreign exercise for them. It was something that they knew inherently, intuitively. It is clear that Pope Francis learned a great deal from the Latin American peoples, and including indigenous peoples, about this process, in addition to the work of the Jesuits and Ignatian discernment. So it's a kind of a combination of these various factors that persuaded him that this was the appropriate and right way to proceed. Not that it wasn't fraught with certain challenges and risks, but it was a work of the Spirit. I think he was right. I think it's been validated by the experience many of us have had. Too few, but many of us. I just want to mention one thing, and in part responds to Joe Sinisak's question as well. In the Diocese of London, Ontario, in the Simcoe area, Simcoe Waterford area, there's a cluster of parishes, and many of those parishes are under the pastoral oversight of a community, as I understand it, of priests from East Africa or West Africa. And they have bought into synodality in a very powerful way. And when one of their congregants went to them and said, would it make sense to have Michael Higgins come and to talk to you about something of the experience that he had in Rome, though his experience was limited to covering the synod, not actually participating in it as a delegate, but covering it. And not only were they not resistant to it, but they have moved to create an event, which will happen sometime in May, in which we will gather as a community of several churches under the enthusiasm of their local pastor, but with the collective wisdom of the lay people who helped to do the preparatory work for the Diocese of London prior to the first session of the Synod. So there's a kind of process in place. It's knowing who to go to. Sometimes, you'll go to a pastor and you say, would you like a talk on synodality? Oh, God, I would love a talk on synodality because I don't know what it means. And it would get some of the lay people off my case if we did this. So sometimes it's just a matter of taking the initiative and saying, look, synodality is the future of the church. So it behooves us to learn something about what that means and why it's not scary, but it's an outcropping of the Spirit. And it is, in my view, the great Bergoglio project that will define this papacy in the same way that in 1959, when Angelo Roncalli, John the 23rd, summoned the First Council, that was his signature papal achievement.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Christine, do you want to add something?
Yeah, two things. First of all, I think it would be a great academic exercise to find out how much indigenous practices affected the Jesuits and influenced some of these processes. I have no idea, but I suspect that there is a relationship there. The other thing is that what I would hate to see is another form of fundamentalism creeping in. And this is what I mean by this. Conversations in the Spirit are terrific and they're wonderful, but they're not the only way to to have synodal listening. And and in fact, in some situations, they wouldn't be appropriate. So if you were having a pastoral council meeting and you had synodal listening sessions every time you had a pastoral council meeting, you're not going to have anybody coming to your meetings because they're kind of big picture discernment, but we can have other kinds of discernment and other kinds of synodal listening. And that's where, Daryl, I think your communities have a great deal to offer us in terms of wisdom of how to do this, because this practice is so vital and so central to how Indigenous communities make decisions. But there are also all kinds of other possible ways for us to have listening sessions. And I already see that happening a little bit, that just like, oh, well, we have to have a conversation in the Spirit. Well, and Joe, I think absolutely I don't see any other way to disassemble the camps.
No, you're quite right. You can have abbreviated versions of it. You can be
Yeah.
fairly creative about it. My concern, however, is not with what some are now calling synodality fatigue. My concern is with synodality, lack of synodality awareness. I think that's the greater challenge, that people don't know what it means and why it's of value. But you're quite right. You can't open every council meeting, every event by having a protracted exercise in conversations in the spirit. But you have to have that at some point. It's like the Ignatian exercises. If you're going to go deeper into the spiritual life through the lens of Ignatian spirituality, at some point or other, you're going to have to move beyond the 8 week to the 30 or 40-day full immersion. So it seems to me that that's the same thing with synodality. Have that experience of conversations in the spirit. And many of us, and I'm sure this is the case with you, Christine, and with you, Daryl, carry the experience that we had at Waterloo with us now. We don't have to repeat that ad nauseum, and we are carrying that with us. But many people have not anywhere near that experience, and that's my concern. You can't have buy-in, to use that phrase, you can't have buy-in from the large membership of the church if they don't know what it is.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, Christine. The time flies very quickly, and we already ending our meeting and our webinar. I think it raised a lot of questions, and we could not answer every question, but Marisis is the editor of the Novalis Publishing, will take care of this to follow these questions to you. And if you could answer this, I think participants will be very grateful. I think all of us who are participating in this webinar directly or through the recordings, we can always read the book.
Yes, please.
And invite you, Michael, to share around this book. In order to this, every participant who actually is participating, but those who will watch the recording while being registered, everyone received in their chat box the promotion code for the discount for this book in order to enjoy, and maybe even to offer to someone like a pastor or the president of the pastoral or economic council for Easter. Why not?
No.
Or maybe for Christmas. Every occasion is good for the synodal way. So do you say a few last reflections on this book, and we will wrap up?
I think the book for me was a way of stimulating conversation, allowing people to see the synodal process as a deeply human process. There are players, as Christine says, and they play their role in the drama that is synodality. And once you begin to know some of these players and you meet with them and you have some food with them and you drink with them and you argue with them and you argue with them in and outside the church, in and outside the aula, what you're doing is you're building communion. So disagreement and argument are not in and of themselves things to fear. As Pope Paul VI said in his very first encyclical, we grow as a church through dialogue. Truth is discovered in dialogue. So it is critical for us to keep the channels of dialogue open. Synodality is one of the major means of doing so. And it is this phase in the life of the universal church we are in right now. And that's why we should be excited about it. And as Christine says, we should be hopeful about it. Not because it will realize all its fruits in our lifetime. It won't. We're still waiting for the full fruition of the Second Vatican Council, for heaven's sakes. But what we're doing is we're part of a tremendous energy in the life of the church. And we need to bring in as many participants as we can.
Do you want to say anything?
Oh, I just really, I encourage people to read the book. It really was, it's a great introduction. And it's very readable. You might have to look up a word or two because that's how Michael writes.
And it's very
But
interesting.
that's part of the fun.
Yes.
I was looking up the words.
Dear Christine, dear Michael, thank you very much for this wonderful dialogue. Thank you for Novalis Publishing Group to allow us have this dialogue. And thank you for your reflection in what you, Michael, rightly called the synodal awareness that we all need. Thank you, and see you another day. And thank you to all participants.
Thank you, Edward. Great talking, Christine.
Yeah, it was great.
Take care. Take care, folks.
Take care.